Scout of the Endless Frontier, Episode 3, Beneath a Corporate Shadow, by Elton Gar. Elias sat and watched the last living organism from Galthera 6 as he tried to come up with a solution. The only thing he came up with was having avoided using the autodock 2 days ago. But the broken ribs might have killed him, and even if they hadn't, it was too late to do anything about that. The problem was that the corporate-built junk had also locked him out of a significant portion of the controls of the Ghost Wake, insisting that he go to a doctor before anywhere else. Because it had been built by the Vitalis Health Consortium, it only listed VHC colonies and stations. But, for some reason, near the bottom, there were a few unaffiliated colonies. Likely places that VHC wanted to keep good relationships with so they could take over their healthcare system when it got large enough to be profitable. So he picked the nearest, a colony with no official corporate sponsor and about 1,000 people. The autopilot took over and landed him next to the small town. When Elias stepped out, he saw a young woman with red hair and a doctor's bag waiting. He put his hand against the door as he stepped out, nearly tripping over Rust, who rushed past him. The woman, who looked too young to be a properly trained doctor, bent down to rub Rust's head. Elias tried to look uninjured, but he leaned more heavily on his cane. "Since you're standing, I assume this isn't an emergency," the woman said, putting her bag to the side as she continued to pet Rust. "A couple of broken ribs. The corporate overrides on the autodock wouldn't let me pick any destination that didn't have medical aid. So here I am. If you sign the papers, I'll buy what supplies I can and be out of your hair by evening, Doctor," Elias said. "Call me Allie, but I'm not going to just rubber stamp broken ribs. If the autodock says you need me, then I'm going to make sure there's no permanent damage," Allie said. She wasn't wrong, and he let her show him the way to her office. The small town was poorer than a corporate colony would have been. There were only about a dozen of the small metal containers that served as temporary housing, big enough for 2 or 3 people to live in comfortably, or to hold supplies for the rest of the colony. They formed the town center. Past that were buildings that had been built here. It gave the town an odd look of the poorest parts of a corporation city and something out of a western. But at least they had the good sense to put the doctor in one of the metal buildings. It was small, but at least it was clean enough you wouldn't get more sick by visiting the doctor. Once inside, Elias removed his shirt without having to be asked. It hadn't been easy to get on, and it wasn't easy to get off, because every movement still hurt. The bandages covered most of his chest, but the purple bruises could still be seen past it, and when the doctor looked, she saw that his back was one huge bruise, though the autodock had begun to heal that. "I'll need at least some details," Allie said, so she wasn't entirely new to the frontier, Elias thought. "Just a bit of a brawl. A veteran slammed me into a wall," Elias said. He had enough medical training to know that he didn't know enough to decide what to tell the doctor. "Did it break the skin?" she asked, carefully poked one of the bruises with something soft. "There were some cuts and scratches, and the wall may have been old rusted metal," Elias said. "So we'll give you a few shots for that. I'll want to check under the bandages as well," the doctor said. He carefully raised his arms. As she cut the bandages away, she said, "You mentioned supplies. Are you free to do some work?" The assumption that he couldn't pay for them was a pretty safe one, not just because most scouts barely made enough credits to pay for ship repairs, but because those credits weren't worth very much way out here. A colony this far out would get a supply ship maybe twice a year, if they were lucky, and that was the only place you could spend the credits. "Assuming it doesn't involve breathing too heavy, or anything else that's strenuous," Elias said. Allie sighed and gathered her strength, then said, "You've stepped into a bit of a hornet's nest. What do you need?" "What does it say about the town in the register?" Allie asked. "No corporate affiliation. Population 1,134. Majority human. Technology is restricted to level 6 and below, except for medical technology. I can go on, but it gets less interesting from there. Didn't specify the name of the doctor, if that's what you're worried about." She looked around, even though it was a tiny room and they were alone, then said, "This colony isn't exactly what it appears. Didn't you think it was odd that there was a full doctor in a colony with only 1,000 people?" "There are thousands of colonies on the list, and I was only given those that included a doctor," Elias said. But now that she pointed out, it might have been safer to go to a corporate colony. At least when you visited a corporate colony, you knew what the dangers were. Well, we're officially a subsistence colony. No real exports, no experiments, there isn't enough mining to be profitable, and, of course, no corporate sponsorships, Ali said. And I'm assuming that's not accurate, he said. Not exactly. Have you heard of the corporate index? I've heard the myth. It's a list of every dirty secret that the corporations have, Elias said. It's not as all-inclusive as people might like, and it's not nearly as mythical. About 10 years ago, someone got past the firewalls of Ascendant Systems, and it turns out they'd built a back door into some of their mainframes. He downloaded everything he could on the Corps, and used the back door to get into others. Most importantly, Nexacorp. Who has the largest spy organization of the Corps, Elias said. The station his mother lived on, and he had grown up on, was run by Nexa. The mass surveillance of the Corps was one of the things he had happily left behind. Elias closed his eyes, seeing exactly where this was going. And you brought it out to the frontier. A copy. 1 of 3. It was just supposed to be a backup. A way to keep the other 2 safe. But someone is working for the Corps, Ali said. So, you can't trust anyone, Elias said. The doctor sat the data pad Elias had handed her to sign and said, I hate to do this, but this is too important. What does that have to do with there being a doctor here? Elias asked. The index is in a virus created on an unrestricted station, designed to protect itself, the woman said. Then it is safe, and I left the corporations behind for a reason. I am not interested in getting caught up in this insanity. I'm sorry, but I can't let you go until we know where the virus is. It could have jumped into you. Elias pretended he was trying to decide for a moment, but she was right. He could refuse to help, but that wouldn't get him off the planet, so he said, I'll look around. Walking out of the small doctor's office, Elias began to look more carefully at the town. The oddity of this place was well hidden. It really did look like any number of poor frontier colonies that Elias had visited. But now that he knew what to look for, he saw the differences. The most basic was that the streets were actually streets, instead of just being wide paths where people walked. The buildings were also too well put together. Mostly, though, there was a lack of people working. A colony like this should have gardens and fields everywhere, not because they didn't bring enough food, though that wasn't uncommon, but because having food stored up was the priority of any colony. Over the next few days, he traded away most of the boxes of fruit for a wider variety of food, bartered for a few basic supplies, and even bought a few things with credit, though the last was difficult and expensive, since it would be months before they could spend those credits. He also discovered 2 important things: that Ali was an excellent doctor, and that he had been more injured than he had been willing to admit, because with painkillers and some doctoring, his mind seemed to clear. His plan was simple. Most people didn't understand just how terrifying unrestricted technology was. Even a level 10 virus could infect an entire civilization, rewrite not only genetic codes but matter at the atomic level, and not only record all of human knowledge, but understand it better than any human. And that was still a restricted virus. An unrestricted virus, if you had access to the correct technology, could be smarter than a human, create new viruses, turn matter into energy, and do things that even the scientists barely understood. The only real question was its sentience. A thinking virus would be almost impossible to find when it could jump between people. But it could find him, so Elias made sure he was visible. He was about to give up on finding the virus when the Ghostwake sent him a message that there was a ship approaching. An unexpected ship was a problem any time, but this was a medical ship from VHC. He had always known that the autodoc would send data to Vitalis. It was one of the reasons he avoided using it, but he had just assumed that they'd sell that information to other corps. He had never considered the possibility they would do more than that. But then, leaving the corporations behind was one of the best things about being on the frontier. As a young girl approached, she said, "You will help me." It was a young girl's voice, but it held too much authority, too much power, and he knew what this was. The virus was in her, and he hoped that there was at least something of the girl there, too. "I assume that you saw a VHC medical ship was on its way," Elias said. "I am an information virus. If they had not inoculated themselves, I would know everything in this colony. But they have me nearly cornered." And it all became more clear to Elias. There was a spy in the colony. the perfect person to hunt down a virus, and the one who was trying to force him to help. The doctor, who almost certainly worked for VHC. They weren't here because of his autodoc. He was here because Allie had wanted help. I don't know how I can help you. She will not let me leave, Elias said. And of course that was true. He might get away after they caught the virus, if he was lucky, but just knowing that the index existed made him dangerous. I was built, not born, and because of that, my primary goal is not reproduction or survival. It is the protection of my knowledge, the girl said. I have no interest in being involved in any of this, Elias said. Which is what makes you useful. If VHC captures me, they will use it to gather more power, as would any corporation. And if it was released, it would cause a great deal of harm, and likely nothing else. But you would do neither. Do you have a plan? I will move from this girl into you, and we will leave, the virus said. Can you duplicate yourself? Elias asked. I cannot, it said. Then it won't work, because until they find you, Elias started. But then he had an idea. It is a risky plan, the virus said, able to pick his thoughts out even before they were fully formed. But it might work, Elias said, trying his best not to think about what he would have to do. Elias had little time, so he rushed to the Ghost Wake. His ship still wouldn't take off. That was no surprise. Whatever deal the VHC had made to allow their autodocs to override the ship wouldn't let him go now, but that wasn't why he was here. It was risky, and it could be considered a betrayal, but as he rubbed Rust's head, he knew it was the best chance they had. He then glanced around the ship, at the piles of tools, the maps, the computers, his hammock in the back, and his now half-full cargo hold. Finally, at the old wooden chair and the last living organism from Galthera 6. Perhaps it was time to admit that things didn't always survive, even if they were strong. He then walked out, Rust following him. This time the medical building had a more ominous feel, and he saw Allie, not as a friendly face, but as a corporate spy. But he understood that mindset better than friendly in many ways. He knew how corporate goons thought. I know you work for VHC, Elias said, as soon as the door was shut. I suspected you'd figure that out. Then the ship showed up, and it seemed inevitable. Perhaps it was wrong to involve you, but we would have preferred to capture the virus. Still, the choice has been made. This colony is too dangerous to VHC. A cancer, if you like. So we will cut it out so that the larger organism can survive. You mean you're going to kill everyone here so you can continue to drain entire worlds of their resources in return for basic health services, Elias said. It is the way of the universe. If we don't make a profit, we can't compete, and others will be worse, Allie said. Perhaps you are correct. What matters to me is that I don't want to die, so I brought you the virus, Elias said, and he nodded towards Rust. He didn't like it, but this was his best chance at survival. The dog, smarter than most, must have sensed something because it moved behind Elias. Or perhaps it was the virus that was causing the reaction. It is a brilliant plan. I never would have considered checking the dog. So, you get the virus, and me and Rust walk out if you're alive, Elias said. I wish it were that easy, Allie said. I thought you might say that, Elias answered, and he took the talon from his gun belt. Shooting me won't do any good. There are more people on that ship than there are on this planet, and they don't even plan to come to the surface, Allie said. But he didn't point the gun at her. He pointed it at Rust, and she understood immediately. The virus, as powerful as it was, couldn't survive without a host. Okay, that information has some value, Allie said. Elias relaxed a hair. He wasn't sure if he could have pulled the trigger, even knowing that they were both going to die if this plan didn't work. The idea of shooting Rust just made him sick. Just pet the dog, Elias said. The doctor bent down, and Rust allowed her to pat him. As she did, he saw her hand begin to shake. The transfer wasn't as easy as it had been for Elias, but that wasn't surprising, and, unlike him, her eyes widened as she began to see the data. Elias hadn't seen that information, but for this to work, she needed to see exactly what she was expecting. The smile that crossed her lips showed everything he feared. Enough power to make anyone who had that information an important member of VHC. Probably not enough to get on the board, but perhaps enough to save his life. As she stood there, taking in the information, Elias moved the talon so it was pointed at her, and said, "Just sign the papers and we can be done with all of this." The doctor seemed barely there. The virus was overloading her mind. That was probably why Rust had been afraid too. Perhaps that was why she picked up the tablet and put her thumb to it, unlocking the ghost wake so he could leave. Elias didn't wait for her to change her mind. He began to run, Rust following. He was alive, and so was his dog. That had to be enough. He started the ghost wake, and didn't relax until the faster-than-light drive was taking him away from the Commonwealth as fast as it could. He then walked over to the plant, where he had put the real virus, and bent down. The mock virus worked perfectly. It will be at least a few weeks before she realizes it wasn't the real virus. And, if she's as smart as I hope, she won't admit to being fooled. She'll just pretend she still has access to the information. He then sat and watched the small hardy plant that had survived the destruction of an entire world that now held enough information to destroy many more. Author's note: this story took me considerably more time than most. The problem, if it is a problem, is that there's a lot of world building in this story. The biggest part of the world building is designing how technology works in the Commonwealth. Not all of that was used in this story, but it will come up many times in the future. The first thing to understand is that the rules about what technology are allowed are one of the few laws universally enforced in the Commonwealth, and every planet and station is different. Also, just because a technology may be allowed doesn't mean that it's known to the inhabitants or to humanity. Humanity is roughly in the middle technology-wise. They are multi-world species and growing fast, but there are many others who understand the universe better, and some of them might want to bring their technology onto a station without sharing. The other part of the system worth understanding is that technology is ranked from 0 to 10, with U standing for unrestricted. Zero Tech is hunter-gatherer level. Current humans are between 4 and 5, and beyond that is science fiction technology. Most places stick around 6 or 7 for technology restrictions, which are in the Star Trek range. But many stations make exceptions for specific types of technology. There will be more details in future stories. If you want to continue to hear them, please sign up for my newsletter at andsci-fi.com, or subscribe to my YouTube channel at AndSci-Fi to get stories narrated by me every week. Thank you, Elton Gar.